So, my name is Eric Debail, if you don't know me. I'm going to talk about, so we'll shift a bit the subject and move to the upper mantle. And we will look at the structure of the upper mantle using results from global surface wave tomography. So the surface wave tomographies have been made in my group in Lyon. And I will try to talk about seismic attenuation, shear velocity structure, and maybe an anisotropy in the upper mantle. So I'm not sure if I have time to speak about everything, but you can interrupt me if you have questions, and I'll try to answer. So feel free to interrupt me. So before to start, I would like just to briefly summarize that all the seismic models that you will see in these presentations are built using a two-step approach. And the first step, so the quality of the slide is not very good, I'm sorry, but I don't know why. The first step is a waveform inversion here. And in fact, this waveform inversion is based on a very simple approximation. We assume the wave follows a grid circle between the epicenter and the station, so we assume Ray theory. But this allows us to, because we use very simple approximation, this allows us to process a very large data set, and in our latest model there is 1.4 millions of waveforms, so it's a huge data set. The waveform inversion is based on a simple approximation, but it's in fact quite a complex nonlinear inversion. And we can match either a Rayleigh waves. The Rayleigh wave is shown here in red, and we match the Rayleigh wave with a synthetic seismogram. And, but it can also be a Love waves, and we will match the fundamental mode of the surface waves, either Rayleigh or Love, which is a dominant part of the signal. And in the period range in which we work here, between 50 and 250 seconds, this gives you information down to 400 kilometers depth roughly. And then we can also match the higher modes of surface waves. So when you sum the higher modes of surface waves, it's intermediate between the fundamental mode and the body wave. But when you sum plenty of higher modes, you build the body waves. And in fact, the few higher modes that we will use, we use 5 overtones at long periods. They give us sensitivity, additional sensitivity, down to the top of the lower mantle. Another important thing is that we match a waveform. We match both the amplitude and the phase of the Rayleigh wave or the Love wave seismograms. And the result of this waveform inversion is a path average shear velocity model and also a quality factor model. So it means that we invert for Q and Vs. And at each step, so it's a nonlinear process. So we use an iterative process to match the waveforms. And at each iteration, we compute the inverted shear velocity model, the quality factor model. Then we compute the dispersion curves. So we have also the dispersion curves of the seismograms for the fundamental mode and the higher mode, and we compute the attenuation curves too. So then we recompute the synthetic seismograms and we iterate. Okay? This stuff is entirely automated, so we can process hundreds of thousands of waveforms, millions of waveforms even, and when we've got a very large coverage, a very good coverage, so we plot ray density maps, because if we were plotting the rays, it will be red. So when we've got a dense coverage, we can combine this shear velocity models in a tomographic inversion. So if we do it for the shear velocity, we get this kind of shear velocity maps with the strengths, and we can also invert for the azimuthal anisotropy. It's in the case of Rayleigh waves. And if we invert Love and Rayleigh waves, we can access to what we call the radial anisotropy. And finally, if we invert the quality factor models, we can get some quality factor maps. So I will start with some results on the attenuation. So I'm not sure why the quality of the slides are so bad. I'm sorry. On my screen, it's very clean. So here, what we show is our attenuation model. So it's an ongoing work at the moment. It's shown at different periods. Why? Because in fact, we do not invert directly for the quality factor model as a function of depth, because when we process the attenuation data are very sensitive data. So we prefer to work on the fundamental mode attenuation curve that we get from the waveform inversion. And if we do that, it's because when we invert for this fundamental mode attenuation curves, we can, at the function of period, so it's the attenuation of Rayleigh waves at the function of period, we can correct for some effects that are very important when we model the amplitude of surface waves, and for example, the focusing or defocusing of the amplitude by seismic heterogeneities. So in fact, we have to be very careful when we process the attenuation data because they are very noisy data. So we correct for this focusing effect. We are also very careful about the source excitation. We have to make sure that the data are not close to a node in the radiation pattern. You know, seismic waves do not radiate energy everywhere with the same amplitude in all directions. And when we are close to a node in the radiation pattern, if we do an error in the localization, if we have an error in the orientation of the focal mechanism, for example, it can produce a huge amplitude error. So we reject this data. We reject data that are likely to have instruments problem, or we also reject data for which there is likely to be a problem in the seismic moment, scalar moment. And finally, we keep only short paths. It's a question of the validity of this approximation. So at the end, we start with 370,000 fundamental mode Rayleigh wave attenuation curves that we published in 2012. And at the end, we've got roughly 200,000 paths, a bit less than that arrived at the end of this process. And then we cluster them because some of the paths correspond to events that are close, recorded at the same station. So if you look at the number of independent paths that you have 200,000 waveforms, but you have maybe 45,000 independent paths. So we can look at the ray density maps that we got with this kind of coverage, with this kind of data sets. And you can see that they are typical of global tomography, high density in the northern hemisphere. But even if you look in the regions where we've got the weakest coverage, we've got more than 200 rays that cross in each region with a radius of 8 degrees, which correspond to the horizontal smoothing that we have put in the tomographic inversion. So basically, the idea is the fact that there is a lot of redundant data in these models. So now let's have a look at the attenuation maps. So it's the attenuation of Rayleigh waves at 50 seconds and 140 seconds. And what you can see at 50 seconds, you're sensitive to the shear attenuation structure with a maximum of sensitivity near 70 kilometers depth. At 140 seconds, your maximum of sensitivity is about near 200 kilometers depth, and then you go a bit deeper with a longer period. So if you look at the maps, you see that we see the long wavelength structure. We see mostly that the craton, the continents are less attenuating than oceanic regions. But there is one thing that is striking, that surprised us a bit when we built these maps. It's the fact that if you look at mid-oceanic ridges in oceanic regions, in general, they are all located in attenuating regions. Okay, but they are not the most attenuating regions, the dominant signal that we see in oceanic areas. And this is surprising because we are used to build phase velocity maps. And if you look at a phase velocity model, so the quality is very, the picture is very bad, but on a phase velocity map, so it's a phase velocity map that is built using exactly the same coverage than the attenuation map. And what we see is that the phase velocity, when we look at the phase velocity maps, immediately what comes up is the fact that we've got strong slow velocity ridges and the velocities that increase when we go away from the ridge. Fine. So we were wondering why we do not get this signal. It's not so clear in the attenuation. And the first thing that we have tried to check is whether there is an age component in our attenuation model. And in fact, if we take our attenuation model and if we average it as a function of tectonic provinces, if we average it as a function of tectonic provinces, as a function of the age, we see that the most attenuating regions are the mid-oceanic ridges, and that the attenuation decreases with the age, and then Paleozoic regions are more attenuating than Proterozoic region and Archean. So there is an age component in these maps, but it's not the dominant signal. Okay? So then what we have tried to do is to take our phase or quality factor maps. Okay? And maybe I forgot to say something. It's the fact that if you look at this quality factor maps, the attenuation map, there is the dominant signal here is not the mid-oceanic ridges, but there is a fairly good correlation between the attenuating regions and the location of hotspots, especially in the Pacific. And this persists at very long periods. And it works quite well also, it's not very clear, but in the southern Indian Ocean. It does not work everywhere, Hawaii, but it seems that there is something that may be related to the hotspots. Okay, so then what we try to do is to compute the correlation between our quality factor maps and our phase velocity maps. And we did that as a function of spherical harmonic degrees. And if we do that, this is what we get. This is the correlation for different periods as a function between the two maps, which are built exactly using the same data set and same smoothing. And you can see that this is, we don't see this curve here, but this curve here represents the 95% confidence level. It means that there is 95% when you are of chance that the correlation is significant when you are above this curve. And what we can see is that at 70 and 100 second period, the correlation is above the 95 confidence level from degree 4 to degree 20. At longer period, it starts at degree 6, and here there is for degree 3, there is a clear, either an anti-correlation between the phase velocity and the attenuation, either a null correlation. So then, to understand all that, we have tried to just plot the long wavelength component of our maps. And if we plot the maps up to degree 3, we filter out the higher degrees on our attenuation maps. We immediately see the reason of the null correlation that we observe at 100 seconds. Here we've got a very strong long wavelength signal, attenuating signal here, which extends from the Hawaii to the South Pacific hotspots. And in velocity, in fact, the dominant signal that we observe is a low velocity reduction beneath the mid-oceanic ridge. Okay? So it seems that we have something, we have something at an attenuation which is located beneath the hotspot. This has a very strong long wavelength component, at least very strong. It's the strongest signal at very long period. There is also a small reduction of velocity beneath the hotspot here, but it's not the dominant signal when you filter that at very long period. So the first thing that we have tried to explain is how can we explain this strong attenuation here? And there was a paper by Barbara and Gung a few years ago, which suggests that there is a strong attenuation in the Pacific, and it's their map at 300 kilometers depth, and they interpreted that as upwelling that will be deflected horizontally beneath the lithosphere. So here I have plotted the map, the filtered map at 200 seconds in our model, and in fact it does not come up very well on the slide here, but there is an attenuating region which is located here, and I'm not saying that it's the same thing, but it means that at least there is some level of consistent information between the long wavelength pattern of our maps and the attenuation that is seen at 300 kilometers, because the maximum of sensitivity at 200 seconds is about near 300 kilometers depth. So it could be that there is thermal upwelling from that is deflected and that produce the long wavelength component of the maps that we observe at 100 kilometers depth. But it seems that if it is true, to produce a large anomaly like this, we need probably to have several plumes. If you assume that the plumes will deflect horizontally at the bottom of the asthenosphere, of the lithosphere, and will produce an anomaly which is 1,000 kilometers in diameter, for example. So then, There is something that is also interesting with this kind of interpretation, is the fact that if we compare to the radial anisotropy, and we are currently building a radial anisotropy model, there is a fairly good agreement with this kind of anomaly and the fact that we observe the strongest radial anisotropy at 100 kilometers depth with SH faster than SV in the Pacific Ocean. And this was also previously observed by Ekstrom and Zywonski. There are other papers that suggesting that there is a very strong radial anisotropy. So Xi SH is faster than SV. I imagine that last week Jean-Paul has done a talk on the anisotropy, and this is compatible. I am sure that he has said that it's compatible with horizontal flow. And at greater depth, we find SV faster than SH, which will be compatible with vertical flow. So this is quite consistent. So then, we have to, the question is, how can we explain the very low velocities that we observe in the Pacific, beneath the East Pacific rise at very long wavelengths, but that are still present if we do not filter the maps. And it seems that these very low S-wave velocities are quite difficult to explain with temperature only from experimental results. And it's difficult to match, in fact, the very strong low velocity reduction that you observe near 70 kilometers depth. So it's possible that there is some melt that may help to reduce further the seismic velocities, and this has been proposed, for example, in a small portion of the East Pacific rise, which was covered by the melt experiment. Okay, so for this first part, it seems that there is a broad attenuation anomaly in the Central Pacific that could result from thermal upwelling that will be deflected horizontally in the Pacific asthenosphere, and maybe melt may explain the low velocity that we observe beneath the East Pacific rise. So now, let's move to the shear velocity model, and let me introduce our latest seismic model, which is called 3D 2015 10SV. So this model is based on all the Rayleigh waves that have a CMT solution that we could extract, and it has been updated up to October 2015. So we take all the data at the permanent station plus a number of temporary deployments. It contains 1.4 million of waveforms. We update it every 3 months, and we follow the publication of the CMT catalog. So so we will update it every 3 months in March, June, September, and November, and each year, and the model will be available. It is already available as a data product at IRIS or on my personal web page, so you can download it. Now, if we look at the seismic models, and we perform a cross-section, and if we average the cross-section as a function of the age, it's terrible, but you should see very clearly that there is a very strong low velocity region here. We see very well the oceanic asthenosphere, the thickening of the oceanic lithosphere, the cratons that are a bit thicker, and the dark line here is marks the thickness of the lithosphere in the half-space cooling model, so it's the square root of the edge. Now, if we do the same thing for the strength of the azimuthal anisotropy, what we observe here is that the strength of the maximum azimuthal anisotropy is observed for young oceanic ages. It is located in the oceanic asthenosphere, and there is something which is also interesting in that it's the fact that if you look at the depth extent of azimuthal anisotropy, in fact, there are some variation here that I will not interpret, but in fact, there is no evidence that the azimuthal anisotropy extends deeper beneath oceanic regions than beneath continents. Roughly, it's the same thing. Okay, now if we look at the strength of the azimuthal anisotropy, but instead to look at it at the function of the age, we look at it at the function of the plate velocity, which is shown here. And the strength of the azimuthal anisotropy is shown with a dashed line here at different depths. You can see that roughly it decreases with depth, but roughly the dashed line are almost horizontal, except maybe the green one at 200 kilometers here. But roughly they are subhorizontal, which means that whether you are on a slow plate or on a fast plate, you still have the same amount of anisotropy. But now, if we look at the part of the anisotropy that is aligned with the plate motion, and it is the green lines which are shown here, you see that the situation is completely different. For slow plate motion, there is almost zero component of the anisotropy that is aligned with the plate. But when the plate velocities start to increase from 3 to 5%, the anisotropy starts to align with the plate, and then it saturates at 5 centimeters per year. And the threshold is near 4 centimeters per year. Okay, and if you look, the strongest aligned anisotropy is observed at 100 and 150 and 200 kilometers depth here. And then it decreases. So from this picture that we built with an initial model and that is still valid with our updated model, we suggested that only the plates that are moving faster than 4 centimeters per year can produce sufficient shearing at their base to organize the anisotropy at large scale. What do I mean by large scale? If we plot now on this parameter, which is the strength of the anisotropy times the cosinus of 2 theta, where theta is the angular difference between the APM, the absolute plate motion, and the fast directions. We plot it for plates that are faster than 4 centimeters per year and slower than 4 centimeters per year. And what you can see is that at shallow depth for the fast plates, the blue regions where the anisotropy agrees well with the plate motion covers only the young oceanic regions. But when we go deeper, we go below the lithosphere in the asthenosphere, and the blue regions start to cover the old oceanic regions. It's not very clear on the slide here, but at 150 kilometers depth, it covers entirely the oceanic regions, and then at 200 kilometers depth, Australia. So it seems that there is really a large-scale process here. If you look at that maps, in fact, it seems that there is really a large-scale process at 200 kilometers depth at the scale of the entire tectonic plates that align the anisotropy with the plate motion. And if we look at the slow-moving plates, we can see that the maps are patchy. There are some blue regions that sometimes cover broad areas, of several thousands of kilometers, but it's never at the scale of the entire tectonic plate. And if we look at this at greater depth, the large-scale pattern that we observe at 250 kilometers is disorganizing here, and the maps become patchy. And then at 250 kilometers, there are some regions where the anisotropy agree with the plate motion, but then the maps remain patchy at all depths. So now, if we look at the angular difference between the anisotropy and the plate motion, and if we do that for fast-moving plate and slow-moving plate, we find for the fast-moving plate, it's the angular difference between the anisotropy and the plate motion. We find this asthenosphere layer where the anisotropy agrees quite well with the plate motion. We do not find it in average for the slow plates. Finally, what we have tried to do is to check the idea then that the shallow anisotropy is aligned is frozen within the lithosphere. And to do that, what we can do is to compute what we call the FAVE, the fossil accretion velocities, which are obtained from the gradient of the age, and it is in fact the direction of the expansion at the time of the formation of the lithosphere, which has been moved, translated to its current location by the plate motion here. And on this slide, we plot 4 colors. The dark blue one corresponds to the region where the anisotropy agree with the plate motion and the fossil accretion velocities, and it's mostly the young oceanic regions where the absolute plate motion is almost parallel to the gradient of the age. Now, if we look at the regions where the anisotropy agree with APM, but not FAV, not the fossil accretion velocities, you can see that the blue regions start to cover entirely the whole oceanic basins at 150 and 200 kilometers depth. The regions where the anisotropy agree with the fossil accretion velocities and not the absolute plate motions, it's mostly the old oceanic basins at shallow depth, and the green regions disappear when you go below the lithosphere. And finally, the regions where the anisotropy agrees with nothing cover most of the plates at below 250 kilometers. So then, there is a last point that I will make is about the depth extent of the anisotropy. You probably all remember this cartoon by Gung and Romanovich, which suggests that from radial anisotropy there is a layer where SH is faster than SV below, which is located between 80 and 250 kilometers, maybe beneath oceanic regions, and deeper beneath continents. And this is commonly used to say that maybe the anisotropy align with the plate motion in a layer which is deeper beneath continents than beneath oceanic regions. But when we look at the strength of the azimuthal anisotropy, in fact, we see that there is no clear difference in the reduction of the azimuthal, in the depth extent of the azimuthal anisotropy beneath continental regions and oceanic regions. So we were a bit worried by that, and we are currently working on this radial anisotropy model. And the fact is that the radial anisotropy model that we have built is quite consistent with what has been obtained by the Barbara and her group. The colors are terrible here, but all the quatons, believe me, have SH faster than SV at 300 kilometers depth. Okay, so we find that SH is faster, that there is significant radial anisotropy in this layer below 200 kilometers depth. So this brings me to the second part of my conclusion. So no ocean continent difference in the depth extent of the azimuthal anisotropy. This is different from the radial anisotropy observation, and we suggest that the anisotropic crystals may be predominantly oriented in the horizontal plane. This will produce SH faster than SV and azimutally random at very large scale. And in this case, you will not have significant azimuthal anisotropy. And in fact, this is consistent with the idea that only the fast plates can organize the anisotropy at very large scale, in fact, because the only continents that are located on fast plates are Australia and India. And that's it. I think I can stop here. Thank you.
I was very intrigued by your attenuation models, and one note and a question. The note is that when you compare the misfit of flow model predicted radial anisotropy with what is observed in older radial anisotropy models, there are deviation patterns that can be interpreted as having higher volatile content, and those patterns are not too dissimilar from the places where you find high attenuation, which is sort of intriguing. So maybe there's some difference in the volatile state in the asthenosphere under these regions underneath the plumes. The question is, if it looked like, and as you pointed out from the spherical harmonic analysis, there was quite a large, decorrelation between the temperature and the attenuation. And I wonder if you tried something like look at a regional correlation or damp the attenuation toward the temperature to see which regions really look very different. And if you've done that, if it looks the same as this degree 3 pattern that you pointed out.
No, we didn't. Do you mean if we have looked at it regionally, in fact?
Yeah. Or you could say, well, let's make the assumption that everything is temperature, and then VS and Q should have some relationship that Uli can tell us about, and then damp it against that and see which regions really don't want to behave like that. Or that would be one way of doing it.
It's definitely something to do, but we didn't do that yet. What we have done is to compare the ratio of Q perturbation over VS perturbation globally, and to compare that with predictions that comes that were we took in the TreeSmack model, so that comes from the geodynamics and the model. So and it fits quite well globally, but we have not done a regional analysis. Yeah, Ved. There is
Okay.
Caroline also, but
Okay. I guess to follow up on that a bit, and yeah, it's fascinating that you see this displacement of the high attenuation region away from the ridges. And you explained if I understood you correctly, you explained the low velocities by invoking melt in the mid-ocean ridge system, and then the high attenuation by invoking, I guess, temperature or, well, volatiles. But I guess my question is, wouldn't melt in the mid-ocean ridge system also produce high attenuation?
That's a good question. So in fact, my answer 2 days ago would have been that from the literature that I read, it seems that in fact, from the papers of the Karato group, in fact, they say that melt would have a stronger effect in attenuation, in velocities and in attenuation from poroelastic model. And then I had a discussion with Uli, who destroyed entirely yesterday my this interpretation, which was working very well. And he told me that fortunately France won the soccer this year today, so I'm quite happy of this little vengeance.
You lost one thing but won another.
And yeah, so I had a good explanation 2 days before, but it seems that we still see. We have to be careful because it's really qualitative. That we still see a reduction in attenuation beneath the mid-oceanic ridges in average, but we have to quantify that. In fact, if you look at
the age thing you showed.
Yeah, the age thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, the mid-oceanic ridges are more attenuating than the rest in average, but it's not the dominant signal. Okay. But it's clear that there is a strong velocity reduction, there is attenuation. Whether it's compatible, we need the main argument for melt, in fact, is the fact that it seems that from experimental data they have difficulties to explain the very strong reduction that in velocity that you observe near 70 kilometers depth. So they took, I think in the paper of Uli, they took the model, the Nishimura and Forsyth model at 0.24 million years, and the velocity that we have in our seismic models are on the order of 4 kilometers per second, and it's very similar to what is found by Nishimura and Forsyth. So I suspect that it's very difficult to explain them with temperature only, in fact, with the effect of temperature and pressure.
Thank you.
Okay. Same topic. I was just looking at the Dalton and Ekstrom attenuation results.
Yeah.
And they have very strongly attenuated ocean ridges down to 250 seconds. So how do you explain those? I mean, these are huge differences between your model and theirs, for instance. How do you explain where this is coming from?
It's something that we were a bit surprised by that. We have tried at one stage. What we have done, in fact, it's quite difficult to explain, in fact, because at one stage we have investigated several things. So first, we have told ourselves that maybe we were just dumping the low attenuation region. So we have done some synthetic tests, and maybe I have one somewhere. But if we, with the quality, well, I'm not sure. It's plenty of things that was different here. Is it a synthetic test? Yes, this is a synthetic test. So, well, you don't see anything, but basically, if you put a mid-oceanic ridges in the input model, we recover it. The amplitude is very nasty, but we recover it very well. We dump it, but we recover it. This is the first thing. Then we have been thinking that maybe it's something that is due to the focusing correction, but the focusing correction does not fix that because you've got a slow velocity. Mm-hmm. So it seems that it's present in the Dalton model, and if you compute correlations between the different attenuation models, in fact, they do not correlate very well at all, neither of them. So The mid-oceanic ridges, it's seen in the Dalton model, but not they are not very clear.
I'd like to briefly comment. I think there is a depth dependence, and so because you haven't really inverted with depth, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So I think the top is really well correlated with the tectonic structures. The top 200 kilometers, which you see very well when you do the regionalization. But in fact, this other signal is coming from below, and you still see it at 100-something seconds. But it's actually, I'm suggesting that you look at this because I think it may be a depth difference.
So we are doing we will do the inversion at depth this month. So we will probably have the answer soon. But it's possible. But I'm not fully convinced, in fact, that it will happen. Because if you do not see the signal very strongly in the attenuation maps, maybe they integrate something that comes from deeper, but.
Most of the velocity models proposed ignore the lateral variations in attenuation. So what do you think about the implications of that on the velocity models that we have? And also I think there's an ongoing discussion that whether we really need a 3D attenuation. And the question I have, the second question is, how good do you think a 1D attenuation model is?
Oh.
How good a 1D spherically symmetric attenuation model is?
So let's start with the first question. Your first question is whether it's important to. But it depends what are your data, what you model. In our case, we model the waveform, so we model the amplitude and the phase. Okay. If we do not invert for the quality factor, okay, it is likely that we will, if your quality factor model is wrong in average. For many paths, it is likely that you will introduce a bias in the velocity that you get. I have done some tests on that, and you can get 2% of an error of 2% on the shear velocity very easily. For example, if you assume that if you make a test and if you assume that there is the attenuation of Prem and you in your data, and you start from a model that has not the attenuation layer of Prem at 80 kilometers. So you can. It depends what you model. But if you model a waveform, if you've got the amplitude and the phase in your misfit, well, you have to do something with the amplitude. Otherwise you will bias your velocity model, and it's why we invert for the attenuation. And there is another. Yeah, we include. Yeah, we do.
See mainly the difference in the amplitude of perturbations or also the distribution of velocity perturbations?
I didn't do it in the tomography. I did it on individual paths. So after we combine, when you do tomography, it's difficult to estimate. But you can imagine that if you've got a region where there is a strong attenuating anomaly that is not taken into account in your model, in this region you will put probably a velocity, you may get in your velocity model an artifact, probably. And maybe he had the second question, but I forgot.
Well, I saw some of those studies that usually with body waves.
Yeah.
Saying that a three-dimensional lateral variations in attenuation may not be that good based on the studies with body waves, and there was a question mark that can we really go from 1D to 3D for attenuation, and there might be people to comment on that here.
So yeah, you have to be careful. So you have to be careful of what we do. So I didn't mention that, but we do not invert for 1 on Q, for example. We invert for the logarithm of Q for several reasons. First, the distribution of the data is more Gaussian. Then you've got less perturbation. so in ln of q. And second, the inverted quality factor model that you get is never negative. And if you parameterize on q, you will get negative value of the quality of the attenuation at one stage. So the parameterization is log of q is something, and then you have to be careful of what you use as a starting model. For example, when I started to do my attenuation studies, I started with PREM, in fact, naively. Can I? Or maybe I can show that. I can remove that. Model tour. Yeah. Okay, so PREM, the attenuation is PREM, is something like this. If you plot 1 on Q as a function of depth, you will get, forgot exactly the trend, but it's something like this. And here you are at 80 kilometers. You've got a strong attenuating layer at 80 kilometers, which comes from the fact that PREM is a global model and which has a strong asthenosphere, and it's 70% of the surface of the Earth. If you start with that, okay, when you are below a Quaton, what you need to do is to remove that, maybe, if I'm correct, and if your Quaton is at 200 kilometers, the thickness of your Quaton is 200 kilometers, I assume that there is an attenuating layer at 200 kilometers, so you have to go from this model to a model that is like this. You know? It never.
PREM has low Q from 80 to 200 kilometers.
Yeah, but not enough. Not enough. Quoi?
The low Q in PREM is from 80 to 200 kilometers.
The low Q, he has, it's what I say. But the strongest attenuation layer in PREM is at 80 kilometers. And then you've got something that persists deeper, maybe to 200, and then it comes back. What I just want to say, 1 over Q, it's 1 over Q that I'm talking. Okay? What I just want to say is that removing that and putting a perturbation behind, you never manage to do that beneath continent. So when I started, the first time I started to invert for the 1 on Q, I started from this model, this PREM model, and what I get beneath continent is my a priori. Everywhere I couldn't get rid of that. So you have to be careful of your starting model. And the choice that I have made after is to start from a Q, which is constant with depth, in fact. And this is much better, in fact, because.
The lithosphere has much too high Q. That's been shown by Direct and Exton in 1995.
Yeah.
QL6, and we can't use PREM for surface wave.
Yeah, but I use a Q which is 200. When I did that, I was still in Australia. It was a long time ago, so I have stopped to do that since 20 years now. But what I'm using is a Q constant model for the inversion of the attenuation, and I think it's the best choice because you let the data choose where they want to put where you want to put an attenuating layer. And for me, it's the best choice because otherwise you put an a priori that is too strong.
Your first question from a non-seismologist. So much of the melting in the Earth happens at depths below, more shallow than 80 kilometers, right? And as you get to shallower depths, you should see more melt if it's decompression melting. So what's the prospect for going to shorter periods to better isolate and distinguish between melting and water? You stop at 50 seconds.
Yeah, but if we want to go at shorter periods, which is possible, we can probably push it to 40 or 40, but then you have to move to a more sophisticated theory, probably. At least, maybe not in oceanic regions, but at least in continental regions, you have to.
And at 50 seconds, what is the sensitivity?
Maximum of sensitivity is at 70 kilometers depth, but you see a weighted average of the structure between the MO. If you are in oceanic region, the MO to 200 kilometers probably. But it's probably why in the Nishimura foresight model or in our model beneath the ridge, the shallow layer, the strong attitude, the strong low velocity reduction. If you look at the Nishimura and Forsyth model, so it's VS04. It's something like this, and here you are at 70 kilometers, and he's using data in the same period range. So maybe it should be shallower if you go at shorter periods.
Can I make a comment on this? I think you need ocean bottom seismometers and regional studies.
We need ocean bottom seismometers. Any other comments?
Thank you.